Okay, let's get into it now. So most of the endocrine system is organized into what we call endocrine axes. And endocrine axes are hormonal relationships between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and some downstream endocrine organ. For example, we have the hypothalamo, pituitary, adrenal axis. And with all of these axes, essentially what we want is these downstream endocrine glands to release hormones and have some effect on the body. But to get to this point, we have to start at the hypothalamus. Now, why would these endocrine axes start at the hypothalamus? The hypothalamus, by the way, is part of the nervous system. It's part of the brain. It's part of the central nervous system. So why would we want these endocrine axes to start in the central nervous system, to start in the hypothalamus? And the answer to that is that because the hypothalamus is part of the central nervous system, it's in an ideal location to receive sensory information from all over the body. And then what it can do is that based on that sensory information, the hypothalamus can activate the appropriate downstream endocrine gland to have an effect, to have an appropriate effect. So it takes this sensory information, it integrates it, and ultimately it activates some downstream endocrine system, some downstream endocrine organ to have a response to that sensory information. And so essentially what the hypothalamus is doing is it's linking the nervous and the endocrine systems. So it allows them to communicate with each other and to work together, to coordinate with each other, which is nice. Now, specifically what's going to happen is that neurons in the hypothalamus are going to release hormones that act on the anterior pituitary. And that's what this is showing a little bit. You have these neurons in the hypothalamus, and it's hard to see, but they're releasing these hormones that travel down to the anterior pituitary and act on cells in the anterior pituitary. In response to this, the anterior pituitary is going to release its own hormones. The anterior pituitary releases its own hormones into the blood, and then those anterior pituitary hormones act on target cells in downstream endocrine organs. So they bind to specific receptors on downstream endocrine organs, and that causes these downstream endocrine organs to release their own hormones. For example, thyroid hormone, which is going to go travel throughout the blood and act on its own target cells throughout the body and have the effect that this whole axis was intended to have. So ultimately, and if we use the thyroid gland as an example, ultimately we want thyroid hormone to be produced and to act on cells of the body to have some cellular effect. But for that to happen, we start all the way up here in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is controlling when the thyroid hormone axis is stimulated. Same goes with the adrenal gland. Same goes with the gonads, and the same is for some other endocrine organs as well. This is a good chance to review some anatomy of the brain. This is a sagittal section, a sagittal plane, specifically a mid-sagittal plane, and this is a medial or sagittal view. And let's just review some different parts of the brain. First off, we have the brainstem, the medulla, the pons, and the the midbrain, the mesencephalon. We also have the cerebellum, regulating motor activity in the back of the brain. Then we have the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. And out here on the edge, we have the cerebral cortex, where our consciousness exists. And then lastly, on top of the brain stem, we have what's called the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is composed of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and also the pineal gland that's located posteriorly. But the reason I bring this up is because I want to point out the anatomical relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Here's the hypothalamus. And guess what? Right below the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. And so there's really close proximity between the two. The hypothalamus receives sensory information. In response to that, it releases hormones down onto the pituitary, specifically the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary releases its own hormones into the blood in response to that, which are going to act on downstream endocrine glands. And this is a more detailed picture of this. And this is worth going over. There's the hypothalamus, and there are the neurons within the hypothalamus. So these neurons, their dendritic endings specifically, are receiving sensory information, and in response to that, they're releasing hormones down onto the anterior pituitary. But how are those hormones going to get down to the anterior pituitary? Well, they get released into what's called the hypophyseal portal system. And when you're talking about the cardiovascular system, when you hear the word portal, that means that there's two capillary beds in a row. Capillaries are where materials are exchanged at. It's where hormones enter the blood and they escape the blood. And so these hypothalamic neurons release these hormones into the first capillary bed, located right below the hypothalamus. Then those hormones travel down to the anterior pituitary, and there's all sorts of endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary. And once those hormones get down there, they escape from the capillary beds. They act on target cells in the anterior pituitary, and then these endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary release their own hormones into the blood in response. And then these hormones, growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, prolactin, they act on downstream endocrine glands to cause the release of further hormones in the axis. Okay, let's talk about our first endocrine axis. This is the hypothalamo-pituitary-thyroid axis. And as the name implies, this axis starts in the hypothalamus. And it's going to start by releasing a hormone called TRH, which stands for thyroid releasing hormone. TRH is going to be released into that portal system, and it's going to act on cells in the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary. And in response, the anterior pituitary is going to release a hormone called TSH, which stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. thyroid stimulating hormone is going to be released into the systemic circulation, and it's going to bind to the thyroid gland. And in response, the thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone, which it releases into the systemic circulation. Now, there's two different forms of thyroid hormone. There's what we call T4 and T3. T4, the name for T4 is thyroxine, and the name for T3 is triiodothyronine, because it has 3 iodine molecules, triiodo. And most of the hormone that's released from the thyroid gland itself is T4. And then what's going to happen, and we'll see this, is that once T4 gets to the target cell, then that T4 is converted to T3. And T3 is the actual active form of the hormone. It's the form that's going to have the effect on the cell. So what does thyroid hormone do? What does T3 do? Well, thyroid hormone is the body's major metabolic hormone. It's going to stimulate metabolism. And in doing so, it's going to affect nearly every cell of the body. Almost every cell in the body is going to have receptors for thyroid hormone on it. Let's take a moment to take a look at the thyroid gland itself. Here's the thyroid gland. It's located on the front of the neck, the anterior side of the neck, right below the larynx. And you can palpate those cartilages right there on the larynx. Those are your thyroid cartilages, and that's your Adam's apple right in the middle. And right below that is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland consists of right and left lobes, and then it's connected by a small band that we call an isthmus. Now, if you were to look at the thyroid gland microscopically, you would see that it's composed of these structures called follicles. And a follicle is a generic term. It means sac. You'll see the term follicle used in different places in anatomy. But basically, you have this follicle, this circle, that is lined by, what type of cells are those? That's simple cuboidal epithelium. So you have these follicles that are lined by simple cuboidal epithelium. And what this epithelium is going to do is it's going to produce a molecule called thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is a thyroid hormone precursor. It's not thyroid hormone itself, it's a precursor. And so it produces thyroglobulin, and it secretes it into this follicle. There's a liquid in there. It secretes it into this follicle for storage. So you're going to have, within these follicles, you have all this thyroglobulin, this thyroid hormone precursor, that's just waiting there to be converted to thyroid hormone and be used. And then what's going to happen is that when thyroid hormone is needed, which is basically all the time, that thyroglobulin is going to be converted to thyroid hormone, and then it's going to be released into the circulation, released into the blood, where it can have its effect on target cells. And you may be asking, why do we go through the process of producing thyroglobulin? Why not just produce thyroid hormone? Well, thyroid hormone is constantly being released by the thyroid gland into the blood, which means that you need to have a storage of it. You need to have a supply of it. You're not able to just produce it on demand. And so because of this, you need that thyroglobulin store within those follicles. And one last thing that I want to point out, I used to go into the details of it, but just mentioning it now I think is fine. To produce thyroid hormone, you need the mineral iodine. And there's places in the world where the soil doesn't have a lot of iodine in it. And so that means that their plants, their food doesn't have a lot of iodine in it. And if you don't have iodine in your diet, then you can get an enlargement of the thyroid gland, and that's known as a goiter. You can see that enlarged thyroid gland right there. And that's simply due to a lack of iodine in the diet. And so fortunately, there was a really simple solution to that. What they did is they took salt and they simply attached iodine onto it. And so this is where people who don't have a lot of iodine in their diet are able to obtain iodine. All right, now let's talk about the action of thyroid hormone, what thyroid hormone actually does. So here we have T4 that was released by the thyroid gland and is now circulating around in the blood. And something to know about thyroid hormone is that it's hydrophobic. And because it's hydrophobic, it can't dissolve in the plasma, and it has to be escorted around the blood by one of these carrier proteins. But then what happens is thyroid hormone gets to its target cell and it's dropped off by this carrier protein. Then what does thyroid hormone do? Because thyroid hormone is hydrophobic, that also means that it's lipophilic. And things that are lipophilic can diffuse straight through the plasma membrane. So just like steroid hormones, that thyroid hormone diffuses straight through the plasma membrane inside the cell. Then what happens? What does it show that's happening next? The next thing that happens is we take that T4 and it gets converted to its active form, T3. Remember, T3 is the active form that's actually going to have the effect in the cell. So right when thyroid hormone T4 goes within the cell, it gets converted to its active form, T3. Then it shows it binding to this binding protein. So you have a binding protein, T3 complex, and then it looks like this binding protein releases T3, and then we get to the more important part here. Then what does T3 do? T3 makes its way to the nucleus, and it binds to a receptor that's located on the DNA, just like a steroid hormone does. And there you can see T3 bound to this receptor that's located on the DNA. And what's going to happen next? The binding of T3 to that receptor is going to stimulate gene expression. It's going to stimulate protein synthesis. And so essentially what thyroid hormone is doing, T3 is doing, is it's stimulating the production of a protein. Now, what does this protein actually do? What does this protein that's made actually do? Thyroid hormone is the major metabolic hormone of the body. And this hormone, this protein that's produced, is going to stimulate cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the major metabolic process that goes on within the cells. And this protein that's produced by the actions of T3 is going to stimulate cellular respiration. It's going to stimulate the conversion of glucose to ATP. So thyroid hormone is our major metabolic hormone. And the reason this is the case is because it's the major stimulus for cellular respiration. It's the major stimulus that's going to stimulate the conversion of glucose to ATP. And it does this by binding to the DNA and producing a protein that's going to stimulate this metabolic event to occur. Now, something else I want to point out about thyroid hormone is that Thyroid hormone also has a calorogenic or a heat-producing effect. So one of the byproducts of cellular respiration that's not shown is heat. And so by stimulating cellular respiration, we're stimulating the production of heat. And it's this heat that's given off by cellular respiration that keeps our body temperatures both elevated and constant. The reason that we're able to maintain our body temperatures at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius, is because we're giving off this heat from cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is being stimulated by thyroid hormone, so you can think of it as thyroid hormone stimulating the production of heat. And, to keep our body temperatures endothermic, to keep them elevated and constant, that requires a lot of input, a lot of energy input to be able to produce that amount of heat. And it also takes a lot of thyroid hormone being produced. Cold-blooded animals like lizards, they're dependent on the external environment for their body temperature. The reason that they're not able to keep their body temperatures elevated all the time is because they're not producing enough thyroid hormone. Okay, their metabolism is a lot lower than warm-blooded animals are. And on that note, the fact that thyroid hormone has a heat-producing effect, it's not surprising that in winter, thyroid hormone secretion will increase to keep that body temperature up where it needs to be. The next thing I want to talk about is negative feedback. And negative feedback is an endocrine mechanism to maintain homeostasis over hormone levels in the blood. It's not surprising that these hormones that we release from these endocrine glands, we want to make sure they fall within specific limits. We don't want those levels to be too high or to be too low. We want them to fall within specific limits. And that's what this diagram is illustrating right here. So for all of these hormone levels, there is a specific level that we want circulating around in the blood. There's a certain set point. But with all variables that we maintain homeostasis over, it never stays at this specific set point. It's not a static line like that. But what we want is we want it to fall within a range around that set point. So as long as it falls within a specific range around that set point value, then we're okay. And what happens with these variables that we maintain homeostasis over is that the variable oscillates around that set point. It goes up, it gets to this high point, and then it goes back down. It gets to this low point. Then it goes back up, then it goes back down. And it does this all throughout the day. So how does this work? How are we able to maintain thyroid hormone levels, for instance, within this range within the blood? And the answer to that is negative feedback. So let's take a look at the axis here. Here's the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases thyroid releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary, causes the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, and in response, the thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone is sent out into the blood to act on target organs. And as this thyroid hormone is released, the levels of thyroid hormone in the blood start to go up. They go up past the set point until finally they get to the high area of this range. And what happens, this is where negative feedback comes in. when hormone levels get to the high point of the range that we want them, that's when negative feedback kicks in. And specifically what happens is that this thyroid hormone, once it gets to that certain high level, then it acts back on the anterior pituitary and also the hypothalamus, and it provides what's called negative feedback. And specifically what it's doing is that thyroid hormone is acting on the hypothalamus, and it's decreasing the release of thyroid releasing hormone. It's acting on the anterior pituitary, and it's decreasing the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. And how does that help us out? Well, by decreasing the hormone levels of both of these, then we're decreasing the stimulation on the thyroid gland, and we're decreasing the amount of thyroid hormone that's released. And so now thyroid hormone release is decreasing from the thyroid gland, and that causes it to go down here. And then what happens is we get to the low point of this range where thyroid hormone levels are low in the blood, and then at that point the negative feedback goes away, and now you have high levels of thyroid releasing hormone, high levels of thyroid stimulating hormone, high levels of thyroid hormone that are being produced. And so it goes back up until we get to that upper range, and then the negative feedback kicks in. And this happens over and over constantly all throughout the day. And this is what's allowing these thyroid hormone levels to be maintained within this specific range. And yeah. What I wanted to do here was look at levels of thyroid hormone release throughout the day. Is thyroid hormone released more during the day, at night, vice versa, or no change? I just wanted to look into that a little bit. And this is what I found from this research article. And what I found is that it varies by individual. It can vary by individual. Here on the left, we have levels of TSH, T4, and T3 in somebody that has what we call strong rhythmicity. And that means that their levels of thyroid hormone vary throughout the day. Here you can see that thyroid hormone levels are higher during the day, then they go down at night, then they go up during the day. So there's some rhythmicity there. But in other individuals, there's not much change with regards to thyroid hormone release throughout the day. This is somebody with weak rhythmicity. And for T4, for instance, you can see that levels of T4 release are pretty constant all throughout the day. Now, naturally, there can be pathology associated with the thyroid gland. And specifically, there can be instances where the thyroid gland is not producing enough thyroid hormone. That's called hypothyroidism. And conversely, there can be instances where the thyroid gland is producing too much thyroid hormone. That's called hyperthyroidism. And there's different causes for each of these, and they each have different symptoms, different effects. And so I made this into an assignment. This is something that you guys are going to turn in. But basically what I want you guys to do is, first of all, define both hypo and hyperthyroidism, and then tell me specifically why each of these conditions results in the symptoms that it does. And what I'm going to want you to do is relate this directly to cellular respiration. with hypothyroidism, what's happening to cellular respiration? Is it going up or is it going down? And based on that, based on what's happening to respiration, how is that causing specifically these different effects? And I want you to do that for both hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. Okay, moving on to our next axis. The next endocrine axis we're going to talk about is the hypothalamo pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. And here's the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland is divided into two parts. There's the outer adrenal cortex area, and then there is the inner adrenal medulla. Cortex is a generic term that means outer layer. There's the adrenal cortex, there's the renal cortex, the cerebral cortex. You'll see the term cortex all throughout the body. And then medulla means middle. And when we're talking about the HPA axis is ultimately going to work on the adrenal cortex. So what happens is the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone called CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. CRH acts on the anterior pituitary to cause the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then ACTH is going to act on the adrenal cortex, and it's going to cause the release of a couple different types of steroid hormones. One of those hormones that's going to be released from the adrenal cortex is cortisol. And cortisol falls into a category of steroid hormones called glucocorticoids. And what glucocorticoids do is they regulate blood sugar, and specifically they raise blood sugar. So cortisol is going to be released from the adrenal cortex, and that's going to have the effect of raising blood sugar. Another hormone that can be released from the adrenal cortex through this axis is aldosterone. And aldosterone is what we call a mineralocorticoid. It's going to regulate the levels of minerals in the blood. And specifically, aldosterone is going to regulate sodium levels. And it's going to increase the amount of sodium that we find in the blood. And we'll get into the effect that that has, but by increasing the amount of sodium in the blood, we're increasing the amount of water in the blood, and that affects blood pressure. So aldosterone is going to be a potent regulator of aldosterone, of blood pressure. What this diagram is doing is it's showing a lot more detail about the different zones of the adrenal gland and what hormones are released by each of those different zones. But before we do that, where do we find the adrenal gland in the body? There's two adrenal glands on the body, and they are located on top of the kidneys. So each kidney has an adrenal gland on top of it. And then you can see that we're breaking the adrenal gland down into the cortex and the medulla. And this is the barrier between the two. And then these are just different zones of the adrenal cortex, which I'm not too concerned about. But let's take a look at the different hormones that are released in these different parts of the adrenal gland. So here we are in the adrenal cortex, and in this upper zone, that's where the steroid aldosterone is going to be released. And then down in this lower zone of the cortex, that's where cortisol is going to be released. Now, another steroid hormone that's released by the adrenal cortex are hormones called androgens. Androgens are a group of hormones. What groups those hormones together? What do androgens have in common? those are all masculinizing hormones. So the main androgen that we think about is testosterone, which is released by the testes, but there are other androgens such as DHEA and DHEAS that are produced by the adrenal gland, and specifically the adrenal cortex. And here's a little note about those, and I'll just go ahead and read this. It says, although adrenal androgens do not appear to play a major role in fully mature males, they seem to play a role in adult women and also a role in both sexes before puberty. And so these androgens do seem to play a role in adult women and in both of the sexes before puberty. And there is some pathology associated with that. You can get hypersecretion of these adrenal androgens, and that can lead to pathology. That can lead to different effects within the body, and I'll show that on the next slide. And then the last thing I wanted to point out here, down in the adrenal medulla, the adrenal medulla is actually under the control of the nervous system. And what's going to happen is that sympathetic neurons, the sympathetic nervous system, sympathetic neurons are going to innervate the adrenal medulla, and they're going to cause the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. And this is all part of the fight or flight response. During the fight or flight response, sympathetic neurons are releasing norepinephrine onto target tissues like blood vessels and the heart and stuff to that effect. But these sympathetic neurons also synapse in the adrenal medulla, and they cause the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are subsequently released into the blood. And so now you have these hormones or these circulating neurotransmitters that are circulating around in the blood as part of the sympathetic fight or flight response. Before we move on, I want to take a moment and talk about these adrenal androgens, because there can be pathology associated with them, and especially when you have hypersecretion of these adrenal androgens, too much of these adrenal androgens being produced. But what I want to spend the most time on with the adrenal axis, the HPA axis, is the stress response. I want to talk about the adrenal gland and the stress response. Now, there's two types of stress responses. There's a short-term stress response and there's a long-term stress response, and we're going to look at both of these. Now, we think of a stress response as a bad thing, but that's not necessarily the case, at least when we're talking about short-term stress. So let's take a look at this. Here we have some type of stressor. Something is stressing us out. What that does is it activates the nervous system. And specifically, it activates the sympathetic nervous system. So sympathetic neurons are going to be activated, and they're going to travel down to the adrenal medulla, and they're going to cause the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the blood. Now, if you're stressed out, what your body is trying to do is prepare you for that period of stress, to get you through that period of stress. And how's it going to do that? What does epinephrine and norepinephrine do? Well, one thing that does is it increases blood sugar. It takes glycogen in the liver and it breaks it down into glucose and ships it out into the blood. And so it increases blood sugar, which is good because when you're stressed out, you want your cells to be able to produce energy and respond rapidly, and they need energy to do that. You need blood sugar to do that. And so that's what epinephrine and norepinephrine are doing. It also increases blood pressure. By increasing blood pressure, you're increasing the rate that nutrients and chemicals are circulating around in the blood. And so cells are able to receive material quicker, and they're able to get rid of material more rapidly, which is both beneficial during a stress response. You increase breathing rate so you get more oxygen and get rid of CO2 more quickly. You increase your metabolic rate. You're increasing the stimulation of ATP so your skeletal muscles can work more during that stress response. And there's also changes in blood flow patterns as well. And specifically, you're going to divert blood to the places that need it, like the skeletal muscles and the heart and whatnot, and you're going to take it away from areas that don't need it. During periods of stress, your digestion and your kidney activity is of low priority. And so you're going to divert blood flow away from the digestive organs in the kidneys and divert them more towards the skeletal muscles and the heart. And that's the short-term stress response. That's the body trying to deal with this short-term stressor. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's your body trying to help you out. The problem is when that stress becomes chronic and you get into the long-term stress response. And that's where the HPA axis comes into play. That's where the adrenal cortex comes into play. So during long-term stress, that causes the hypothalamus to release CRH onto the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary releases ACTH in response, and ACTH acts on the adrenal cortex. And the adrenal cortex releases two types of hormones. It releases glucocorticoids, and the main glucocorticoid is cortisol, and it also releases mineralocorticoids, and the main mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. So let's take a look at each of these. So during long-term stress, the adrenal gland releases cortisol, and cortisol is a glucocorticoid. It increases blood sugar. And the problem with this, with long-term stress, is that at this point, presumably, you've run through your glycogen reserves in the liver and the skeletal muscles. And so the body still wants to maintain blood sugar levels because it is a stress response, but now it's got to get this blood sugar from other places. It's got to get this glucose from other places. And so it takes proteins and it takes fat and it breaks these down and converts it to glucose. And that's not necessarily a bad thing with fats, taking fats and converting that into glucose, but you don't want to do that with proteins. And so that's part of the reason why the long-term stress response can be detrimental, is because in order to maintain blood sugar, cortisol is breaking down fats or breaking down proteins and converting that to glucose. Another effect of that, and I don't completely understand why this is the case, but when you have excessive cortisol being released, the immune system is suppressed. And so you're more susceptible to disease because your immune system is down. And I don't think that's a purposeful thing. I think it's something that just happens when there's a lot of cortisol secretion. Another thing that happens during the long-term stress response is you have mineralocorticoid release. Specifically, you have aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex. And it's still the stress response, and so you're still trying to elevate your blood pressure so things can circulate more quickly, but now aldosterone takes over that duty. And what it's doing is aldosterone is acting on the kidney, and it's causing the retention of sodium. It's causing more sodium to go from what would be the urine back into the blood. It's taking sodium that would normally go into the urine and it moves it back into the blood. And wherever sodium goes, water follows it. So not only does sodium go back in the blood, but water goes back in the blood, and that increases your blood pressure. And chronically high blood pressure that occurs during this long-term stress response is not a beneficial thing.